Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. The thermostat didn't click. My fingers grazed over the wall, tracing the familiar path, but the air remained unchanged, too still, too indifferent. The steps I took across the room sounded softer than they should have, absorbed by unseen ears. The light from the window flickered without a source, retreating as soon as it arrived. No weight shifted on the bed, which always sagged under its own memory. I reached for the familiar fabric, expecting its usual cocoon, but the weave felt thin, like hands that had withdrawn. The fabric spoke of an absence that had settled, quiet and steady as a new habit. I know now that this is how it ends, not with violence or screaming, but with the simple failure of ordinary things to behave as they should. The room has forgotten me, though I still remember it perfectly. My reflection stopped appearing in the mirror 3 movements ago, but I can still see everything else with crystalline clarity. The change is complete, irreversible, and strangely peaceful. There's no going back to what I was before I understood what the sounds meant. But to truly comprehend this ending, I must trace backward through the moments that led here. The memories unfold in reverse, each one more vivid than the present moment, as if the past holds more substance than what I've become. Just before this final stillness, I stood in the hallway outside my bedroom door. My hand rested on the brass knob, and I could feel it warming under my palm the last time anything would respond to my touch with such honesty. Through the thin wood, I heard the sound of my own breathing from inside the room, steady and rhythmic, but I was standing in the hallway. The breathing continued, patient and measured, as if it had been waiting for me to notice this impossibility. I turned the knob slowly, expecting to find nothing, hoping to find nothing. The room was empty, yet the breathing persisted, coming from the exact spot where I would soon stand. The sound was mine, but it belonged to a version of myself that had already crossed over into whatever this was becoming. I stepped inside and the breathing stopped. In that silence, I understood that I was joining something that had been waiting. Earlier still, I remember sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had grown cold. The liquid surface reflected the overhead light, but the reflection moved independently, rippling without any disturbance to the cup itself. Steam rose from the coffee despite its coldness, forming shapes that looked almost like letters, almost like words I should recognize. The kitchen felt larger than it had that morning, the walls having somehow shifted outward while I wasn't paying attention. The refrigerator hummed a tune I'd never heard before, a melody that seemed to respond to my heartbeat, speeding up when I felt anxious, slowing when I tried to calm myself. I reached for the cup, intending to pour the coffee down the sink, but my hand passed through the handle as if it were made of light. The coffee remained exactly where it was, its impossible steam continuing to write messages in a language I was only beginning to understand. That was when I first noticed the sounds weren't coming from outside anymore. They were coming from inside the house, from rooms I hadn't entered, from spaces that shouldn't exist between the walls. Footsteps echoed from the basement, though I had no basement. Voices murmured from the attic, conversations in my own voice having discussions I couldn't quite make out. Before the kitchen, I was in the living room, watching television that showed only static. But within the static, images formed scenes from my own life playing out in grainy, distorted detail. I saw myself as a child, walking through a house that looked exactly like this one, though I'd never lived here as a child. The static child moved through rooms I now knew intimately, touching furniture that wouldn't exist for decades, speaking to people whose faces were obscured by the television's interference. The volume was turned all the way down, but I could hear every word clearly, as if the sound was coming from inside my skull. The static child was looking for something, moving with purpose from room to room, checking behind curtains and under furniture. When the child looked directly at the camera, directly at me, I realized it wasn't searching for an object. It was searching for a way out of the television, a way into the room where I sat watching. I reached for the remote control, but it crumbled in my hands like ash. The static child smiled and began walking toward the screen from the inside. I could see its small handprints pressing against the glass, fingers splayed wide, pushing outward. The television screen began to bulge, and I knew that in moments those hands would break through into my living room. That's when I ran to the kitchen, seeking the normalcy of coffee and morning light, not yet understanding that I was moving deeper into the house's hunger rather than away from it. Going further back, I recall waking up in a bed that felt too large, stretching my arms wide and finding no edges. The mattress seemed to extend infinitely in all directions, an ocean of fabric and springs beneath a ceiling that had risen impossibly high during the night. My bedroom had become a vast chamber, and I was a small figure lost in its center. The morning light came from everywhere and nowhere, casting no shadows despite its brightness. I sat up and saw that the walls were covered with photographs. I'd never taken hundreds of images showing me sleeping in the same bed night after night, but from angles that would be impossible for any camera. Some photos were taken from above, as if the photographer had been floating near the ceiling. Others were shot from underneath the bed, looking up through the mattress. In each photograph, I appeared to be sleeping peacefully, but something else was always present in the frame. A shadow that didn't match any object in the room. A figure standing just outside the photograph's border, visible only as a partial silhouette. Hands reaching toward me from the darkness beyond the bed's edge. As I studied the photographs more closely, I noticed they were arranged in chronological order, documenting weeks of sleep I couldn't remember. In the earliest photos, I slept alone and undisturbed, but as the sequence progressed, the shadow grew larger, the reaching hands came closer, until in the most recent images, something was clearly sharing the bed with me, its form pressed against my sleeping body like a lover or a parasite. I stumbled out of the infinite bed and found that the bedroom door had multiplied. Where there had been one exit, now there were dozens, each leading to a different version of the hallway beyond. I chose the door that looked most familiar and stepped through, only to find myself in the living room where the television waited with its hungry static. But even before that strange awakening, I remember the night I couldn't fall asleep. I lay in the darkness, listening to sounds that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, a rhythmic tapping like fingers drumming against wood, but from the inside. The sound moved around the room, circling the bed like a patient animal. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall, following the tapping as it traveled. The sound was always just ahead of me, leading me around the room in an endless circuit. When I stopped moving, the tapping stopped. When I resumed my pursuit, it began again, always maintaining the same distance, always staying just out of reach. The wallpaper felt warm under my palms, and I could swear I felt something moving beneath it, something that matched the rhythm of the tapping. I found a corner where the paper had begun to peel and carefully lifted it away from the wall. Underneath, instead of plaster or wood, I found another layer of wallpaper. I peeled that away too, revealing another layer beneath it. I spent the entire night peeling away layer after layer, each one showing a different pattern, different colors, different eras of decoration. Some layers were so old they crumbled at my touch, releasing dust that smelled like decades of other people's lives. But no matter how many layers I removed, there was always another one underneath, and the tapping continued from somewhere even deeper within the wall's impossible depth. By morning, I had created a hole large enough to put my arm through, but I still hadn't reached whatever lay beneath all those layers of paper and time. The tapping had grown louder, more insistent, and I realized it was no longer random. It was tapping out a pattern, a code, a message meant specifically for me. That was the night I should have left the house, but I was already too curious, too invested in understanding what was trying to communicate with me from inside the walls. Earlier that week, I had been exploring the house, still new enough to feel excited about the space, still innocent enough to interpret its strangeness as charm. I opened doors I hadn't noticed before, finding rooms that seemed to have been waiting patiently for my discovery. A study lined with books I'd never owned, their pages filled with handwriting I almost recognized. A bathroom with a mirror that reflected the room behind me instead of my face. A closet that extended much further back than the house's architecture should have allowed. In that impossible closet, I found clothes that weren't mine but fit perfectly, garments from different decades hanging in neat rows as if curated for my specific body and tastes. At the very back, where the closet disappeared into shadow, I found a door I hadn't expected. It was smaller than a normal door, painted the same color as the walls so it nearly disappeared from view. I had to crouch to open it, and beyond was a narrow passage that seemed to run between the walls of the house. The air inside was stale and warm, carrying scents of dust and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in water. I crawled through the passage, following it as it curved and branched, creating a hidden network of tunnels within the house's structure. The passage led to small windows that looked into every room, positioned so that someone crawling through the tunnels could observe the house's occupants without being seen. I realized I was looking at my own living room from an impossible angle, watching the space where I would later sit mesmerized by the static television. But the most disturbing discovery was that the tunnels showed signs of recent use. The dust was disturbed in places, forming the clear impression of hands and knees. Someone had been crawling through these passages regularly, watching the house, watching me, learning my patterns and habits. Food wrappers and empty water bottles were tucked into alcoves along the way, evidence of long surveillance sessions. I crawled backward out of the passage as quickly as I could, but the knowledge of those hidden tunnels changed everything. Every room now felt observed, every private moment potentially witnessed by unseen eyes. The house wasn't just strange, it was actively watching me, learning about me, preparing for something I couldn't yet imagine. That night, I heard the first tapping from inside the walls, and I wondered if the sounds were coming from someone moving through those hidden passages, someone who had been living in the spaces between my rooms long before I arrived. On my first week in the house, everything seemed normal, even pleasant. The rooms were the right size, the light fell naturally through clean windows, and my footsteps echoed with the satisfying solidity of hardwood floors. I unpacked my belongings with the contentment of someone who had found exactly the right place to live. The house felt welcoming then, almost eager to accommodate me. Doors opened smoothly, faucets ran clear and hot, and the thermostat responded to my touch with reliable clicks and whirs. I arranged my furniture with care, hung pictures on walls that seemed designed to display them, and filled the rooms with the comfortable chaos of a life being lived. But even then, in those first innocent days, there were small details that should have warned me. The previous owner had left behind a few items: a coffee cup in the kitchen cabinet, a book on the nightstand, a coat hanging in the hall closet. Normal enough, except that these items were exactly the ones I would have chosen for myself. The cup was the perfect size and weight for my hands. The book was a title I'd been meaning to read. The coat fit as if it had been tailored for my body. I told myself these were pleasant coincidences, signs that I'd chosen well, that the house and I were naturally compatible. I wore the coat on cool evenings and read the book before sleep, drinking from the cup each morning as I planned my day. The items felt familiar in a way that was comforting rather than strange. It was only later, as the house began to reveal its true nature, that I understood these weren't coincidences at all. They were bait, carefully chosen lures designed to make me feel at home, to make me want to stay long enough for the house to study me, to learn my patterns, to discover how best to keep me. The house had been preparing for my arrival long before I knew it existed, gathering information about my preferences and habits, creating the perfect environment to trap someone exactly like me. By the time I realized this, I was already too attached to leave, too curious about the mysteries unfolding around me, too invested in understanding what the house wanted from me. And now, tracing back to the very beginning, I remember the moment it all started, the moment I should have recognized as the point of no return, though it seemed so ordinary at the time. I was driving through an unfamiliar neighborhood, not looking for anything in particular, just enjoying the lazy pleasure of exploration. The street was lined with houses that all looked similar but not identical, each one maintaining its own character within the comfortable conformity of suburban architecture. Then I saw a house that looked exactly like every other house on the street, except for one small detail. In the front window, barely visible from the road, was the coffee cup I would later find in the kitchen cabinet. It sat on the windowsill, catching the afternoon light, and something about it made me slow the car, made me pull over to the curb for a better look. The cup was ordinary in every way, white ceramic, simple design, the kind you might find in any kitchen. But as I stared at it through the window, I felt a recognition so strong it was almost physical, a certainty that this cup belonged in my hands, that it had been waiting for me to find it. A realtor's sign stood in the front yard, and before I could think better of it, I was writing down the phone number, already imagining myself living in this house, drinking from that cup each morning, making the space my own. But now, having traced the story backward to its source, I understand that the cup wasn't waiting for me at all. It was watching for me, a simple object transformed into a sentinel, positioned in the window to catch the attention of exactly the right person, someone who would see it and feel that inexplicable pull of recognition, someone who would be curious enough to investigate, trusting enough to enter, and stubborn enough to stay even when the strangeness began. The house had been hunting, using that innocent cup as its lure, and I had driven directly into its trap, mistaking predation for serendipity, confusing hunger for welcome. The cup had done its job perfectly, and everything that followed, the hidden passages, the tapping walls, the infinite bed, the static television, the breathing in empty rooms, had been inevitable from the moment I first saw it sitting in that window, waiting patiently for someone exactly like me to drive by and fall in love with their own destruction. Now I understand why the thermostat doesn't click anymore, why my steps make no sound, why my reflection has abandoned the mirror. The house has finished with me, has learned everything it needed to know, has taken everything it wanted to take. I am no longer the hunter or the hunted, no longer the observer or the observed. I have become part of the house itself, another layer of wallpaper, another set of eyes watching from the hidden passages, another voice breathing in empty rooms, waiting for the next cup to appear in the next window, ready to welcome the next curious soul who mistakes invitation for accident, who sees a simple object and feels the irresistible pull of home. Equals. Story 2. The closet door was slightly open upon inspection. Clothing hung neatly along the rail, organized by color and size, displaying no apparent disorder. On the floor, a pair of shoes aligned precisely against the wall, casting parallel shadows from the hall light. A single hanger was dislodged, resting diagonally across a jacket sleeve. The air carried the faint trace of lavender, consistent with the sachet found inside. No articles were out of their predetermined place. The dust layer on the upper shelf remained undisturbed, yet the scent of fresh earth persisted inexplicably in a windowless space. I checked that closet every morning now, the same ritual, the same careful examination of every detail, because that smell shouldn't be there. Earth doesn't belong in sealed spaces, yet it lingers like a memory pressed into fabric. The investigators found nothing unusual, of course. They measured humidity levels, tested for gas leaks, examined the ventilation system. Their instruments detected only what instruments are designed to detect. But they can't measure the weight that settles in your chest when you stand in that doorway, or the way the air seems to thicken when you breathe it in. Sleep doesn't come easily anymore. When it does, I wake to find my electronics humming softly in the darkness. The coffee maker cycling through its brewing sequence at 3 in the morning, though I never programmed it. The radio crackling with static between stations, voices speaking in languages that don't quite sound human. I've replaced the batteries in the smoke detectors 6 times this month. They keep chirping, that single piercing note that cuts through silence like a blade. The electrician found nothing wrong with the wiring. The devices work perfectly during daylight hours. My neighbors have stopped asking about the disturbances. They used to complain about the lights, the way they would flicker on and off throughout the night, casting moving shadows against their bedroom walls. But the lights aren't controlled by any switch I can find. They pulse in patterns that feel almost rhythmic, like breathing, like a heartbeat slowing down. The power company has inspected the lines 3 times. Everything appears normal in their reports. Yet the lights continue their strange dance, and my neighbors have learned to close their curtains tighter. The dreams are always the same. I'm standing in an open field, looking up at something I can't quite see. The grass beneath my feet feels real, cool and damp with evening moisture. There's a presence above me, vast and silent, blocking out stars I know should be there. I try to look directly at it, but my eyes won't focus. It's like trying to stare at the sun, except there's no brightness, only a darkness that seems to have weight and substance. I wake with the taste of metal in my mouth and dirt under my fingernails, though I showered before bed and my windows were closed. The memory fragments come back in pieces, never complete, never clear. I remember standing outside, my neck craned upward, watching something that shouldn't have been there. It hung in the air without sound, without visible means of support, like a shadow cast by nothing. The edges were difficult to define, shifting and blurring whenever I tried to focus on them. I wanted to move, to run, to call out, but my body felt disconnected from my will. Time stretched strangely around that moment. What felt like hours might have been minutes or perhaps seconds. The world had become very quiet, as if all the small sounds of night had simply stopped. Going back further, I can trace the signs I should have recognized. The humming started weeks before that night. A low, constant vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the sound of power lines but deeper, more resonant. It would begin just as the sun set and continue until dawn. I assumed it was construction work or perhaps new machinery at the facility beyond the ridge. But when I called to complain, they had no record of any overnight operations. The sound wasn't coming from their equipment. My watch stopped working around that time. Not just stopped, but began running backward, the hands moving counterclockwise at an irregular pace. I took it to be repaired, but the technician found nothing wrong with the mechanism. It worked perfectly in his shop, keeping accurate time, responding normally to adjustments. Yet the moment I strapped it back on my wrist, the hands began their reverse journey again. I stopped wearing it, but I could still feel time moving strangely around me, minutes stretching and compressing like elastic. The temperature changes were subtle at first, cold spots that would appear without explanation, small pockets of air that felt like winter in the middle of summer warmth. They would drift through the space around me, never lasting long, never quite where I expected them. I would walk through one and feel my breath catch, see it mist briefly in the sudden chill. Then the warmth would return as if nothing had happened. The heating system showed no irregularities. The insulation was intact. Yet the cold persisted, moving like something alive. Electronic devices began behaving strangely before any of the more obvious signs appeared. My phone would dial numbers I had never called, connecting me to empty lines that carried only the sound of wind or distant machinery. The television would change channels on its own, settling on stations that broadcast nothing but static, though occasionally I could hear voices underneath the white noise, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. My computer would open files I had never created, documents filled with symbols that looked almost like text but conveyed no meaning I could understand. The first indication that something was wrong was so small I almost missed it entirely. A slight vibration in the ground, barely perceptible, like the rumble of a distant train, but there are no train tracks for miles in any direction. The vibration would come in waves, rhythmic and purposeful, as if something enormous was moving far beneath the surface. I would feel it through the soles of my feet, a gentle thrumming that seemed to resonate in my bones. It happened only at night, only when I was alone, only when the world was quiet enough for such subtle disturbances to be noticed. Before any of this began, there was a day of perfect normalcy. The kind of day that exists in memory like a photograph, clear and still and untouchable. I had spent the afternoon organizing, putting everything in its proper place, creating order from the small chaos of daily life. The closet had been cleaned thoroughly, every item arranged with care, the shoes aligned, the hangers evenly spaced. The lavender sachet was fresh, filling the small space with its clean, familiar scent. Everything was exactly as it should be. The evening was peaceful, unmarked by any sense of approaching strangeness. I had closed the closet door completely, checking the latch to ensure it was secure. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, all systems functioning normally, all lights responding to their switches as expected. There was no humming, no electronic disturbances, no cold spots drifting through the air. Time moved at its proper pace, and my watch kept perfect rhythm with the world around it. Yet somewhere in that perfect normalcy, something had already begun. Some invisible threshold had been crossed, some attention had been drawn. The earth was already preparing to leave its trace in places where earth should never be, and the air was already learning to carry sounds that had no source. The change was so gradual, so subtle, that it felt like waking up slowly from a dream you can't remember, except the dream was ordinary life, and the waking was something else entirely. Now I understand that the closet door was never meant to stay closed, and the scent of earth was never meant to fade. Something is still watching, still waiting, still breathing in the spaces between what we can see and what we can prove. The investigators will find nothing because there is nothing for them to find, only the evidence of presence in a world that insists on absence, only the lingering trace of something that was never quite there and never quite gone. Equals. A story 3. I used to see it as a mundane quirk, a mere consequence of our outdated printer spitting out the morning paper with one page slightly askew. The corner snagged on the feed, always the same page, the same corner. It was routine, a comfort in its predictability. However, last Tuesday, the page aligned differently, a subtle shift, strange but ignorable. The next day, another page followed suit, the words slipping slightly off-center. This morning, the entire stack seemed just a touch off, as if someone had nudged the machine. Yet the paper tray is untouched, no sign of tampering, but the edges don't line up like they used to. Nothing happened that night. I want to be clear about that from the start. I was tired, probably just overtired from working late shifts, and my mind was playing tricks on me. The human brain does that sometimes when it's exhausted, creates patterns where none exist, makes you see things that aren't there. I didn't see anything unusual when I walked to my car. The parking garage was empty, which is normal for that hour. Maybe there was a slight hum from the fluorescent lights, but those old fixtures always make noise. The sound was probably just the building settling, or maybe the ventilation system cycling on. Buildings make all sorts of sounds at night. The elevator worked fine. I pressed the button for the third level where I always park, and it went up smoothly. No strange stops, no delays, though I do remember thinking the ride felt longer than usual, but that's just perception. When you're tired, everything feels slower. The doors opened exactly when they should have. My car was right where I left it, space 3C, same as always. The keys were in my hand, though I don't remember taking them out of my pocket, but that's automatic behavior. You do things without thinking when you're following routine. The metal felt warm against my palm, but car keys absorb body heat. That's perfectly normal. I didn't notice anything different about the lighting. The fluorescents cast their usual harsh glare across the concrete, though some of them might have been flickering, creating those moving shadows that dance at the edge of your vision. Old lights do that. The maintenance crew probably needs to replace a few bulbs. The shadows seemed longer than they should have been, but that's just the angle of the fixtures. The silence was normal too. Parking garages are quiet at night. There's no reason for noise when the building is mostly empty. Though it did feel particularly still, like the air itself was holding its breath. But that's just the acoustics of concrete and steel. Sound behaves differently in enclosed spaces. I walked to my car without incident. My footsteps echoed normally, though they seemed to create an odd rhythm, almost like there were more steps than I was taking. But echoes do that. They bounce off walls and create layers of sound that can confuse your perception. I wasn't counting my steps anyway, so I couldn't be sure. The car door opened easily. No problems with the lock, no resistance, though when I sat down, the seat felt different somehow. Not uncomfortable, just not quite the same, like someone had adjusted it slightly. But I'm the only one who drives this car. Maybe the cushions had shifted during the day. Fabric does that with temperature changes. I didn't look in the rearview mirror right away. There was no reason to. I was just sitting there, probably collecting my thoughts before starting the engine. When I did glance up, the reflection showed exactly what it should have, the empty garage behind me, though there might have been a shape near the elevator, something that could have been a person standing very still. But it was probably just a shadow, or maybe a maintenance cart someone had left behind. The engine started on the first try. No mechanical issues, no warning lights, everything functioned exactly as it should. Though the radio came on by itself, which was strange because I always turn it off before getting out. The volume was low, just static mostly, but underneath there seemed to be something that sounded almost like breathing. I turned it off immediately. Old radios pick up all sorts of interference. I backed out of the space carefully, checking my mirrors like always. The garage was still empty. No other cars moving, no people walking around. Though in my peripheral vision I kept thinking I saw movement, just quick flashes like someone stepping behind pillars or ducking between cars. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. Tired eyes do that. They create motion where there isn't any. The drive down to the exit level was routine. I followed the painted arrows, made the turns at the appropriate places. The concrete walls passed by at normal speed. though I did notice that some of the parking spaces I drove past weren't quite empty, not occupied by cars, but not completely vacant either. There were impressions in the dust, perfect rectangles where vehicles should have been parked, but the outlines were too precise, too deliberate, like someone had carefully marked where cars belonged. I didn't stop to examine them. There was no reason to. Dust settles in patterns all the time, especially in places where cars park regularly. The oil stains and tire marks create boundaries that collect dirt differently. It's basic physics, though the shapes did seem to glow slightly in my headlights as if the dust itself was somehow luminescent. But that's just how particles reflect light. The exit booth was unmanned, which happens sometimes during late shifts. The barrier arm was up, so I drove through without stopping, though I did glance at the booth as I passed, and the interior light was on. The chair was pushed back from the desk, and there was a coffee cup sitting there, still steaming. Someone had just stepped away, probably to use the restroom or check something in the building. But the cup was positioned perfectly in the center of the desk, and the steam rose in a completely straight line, despite the ventilation system that should have been moving the air around. Steam doesn't behave that way normally. It disperses and swirls. This looked almost solid, like a white column connecting the cup to the ceiling. I only saw it for a second as I drove past, so I could have been mistaken. The street outside was empty, which is normal for that area at night. No traffic, no pedestrians, just the usual streetlights casting their pools of yellow illumination. Though between the lights, the darkness seemed more complete than usual. Not just the absence of light, but something denser, like the shadows had weight and substance. But that's just contrast. Your eyes adjust to brightness and make everything else seem darker by comparison. I drove home without incident, made all the correct turns, stopped at the appropriate intersections. The route was familiar, automatic, though I do remember that none of the traffic lights changed while I was driving. They stayed green for me at every intersection, which was convenient but unusual. Traffic lights operate on timers and sensors. The probability of hitting all green lights on that route is pretty low, but not impossible. My house looked exactly the same as always when I pulled into the driveway. Same exterior, same landscaping, same porch light glowing by the front door. Though when I got out of the car, I noticed that my footprints from earlier in the day were still visible in the dew on the walkway. But there were other prints too, leading from the street to my front door and then back again. They were the same size as mine, the same shoe pattern, but they were too deep, pressed into the concrete as if whoever made them was much heavier than me. I didn't examine them closely. Footprints in dew evaporate quickly, and the lighting wasn't good enough to see details anyway. They could have been from the mail carrier or a delivery person, or even from me earlier in the day when I wasn't paying attention. Memory isn't always reliable about mundane details like where you stepped. The front door was locked exactly as I had left it. The key turned smoothly, no problems with the mechanism. Though when I opened the door, the air inside felt different, not stale or stuffy like a closed house should feel, but fresh, as if windows had been open all day. But I always keep the windows closed when I'm not home. It's more secure that way and more energy efficient. The interior of the house was undisturbed. Nothing moved, nothing out of place. All the lights were off, just as they should have been. Though when I flipped the switch in the entryway, the bulb seemed brighter than usual. Not harsh or glaring, but more illuminating. It cast light into corners that are usually shadowed, revealed details in the wallpaper pattern that I hadn't noticed before. Old bulbs sometimes surge brighter just before they burn out. I went through my normal routine, hung up my coat, set my keys on the table, checked the mail. Everything was routine, comfortable, familiar, though I did notice that the house felt larger somehow. The hallway seemed longer when I walked to the kitchen, and the ceiling appeared higher than I remembered, but perception changes when you're tired. Spaces can feel different depending on your mental state. The kitchen was exactly as I had left it. Clean counters, empty sink, everything in its proper place. Though when I opened the refrigerator to get some water, the light inside flickered in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, like a code or a signal. But refrigerator lights are just simple switches activated by the door. They don't have complex circuits that would create patterns. It was probably just the bulb getting loose in its socket. I didn't stay downstairs long. There was no reason to. I was tired and ready for bed. Though as I climbed the stairs, I could hear something that sounded like footsteps above me, matching my pace exactly. But old houses make noise when you walk through them. The floorboards shift and creak, and sound travels through the walls in unexpected ways. What I was hearing was probably just the echo of my own steps, delayed by the acoustics of the stairwell. The upstairs hallway was dark, which was normal. I don't leave lights on when I'm not home, though there seemed to be a faint glow coming from under my bedroom door, very subtle, barely visible, like moonlight, except the moon wasn't full that night. It could have been light from the street filtering through the curtains, or maybe the display on my alarm clock was brighter than usual. My bedroom was undisturbed. The bed was made exactly as I had left it, the curtains drawn, everything in order. Though when I sat down to take off my shoes, the mattress felt different. Not uncomfortable, just not quite the same firmness I was used to. Like someone else had been lying there, leaving an impression that hadn't quite faded. But mattresses respond to temperature and humidity. The material expands and contracts throughout the day. I didn't turn on the overhead light. There was enough ambient light to see what I needed to see, though the shadows in the room seemed more defined than usual, with sharper edges and deeper blacks. The corner by the closet was particularly dark, so dark that it seemed to absorb light rather than simply lacking it. But that's just how shadows work in low light conditions. Your eyes create contrast where none exists. I went through my normal bedtime routine, changed clothes, brushed my teeth, set my alarm, everything routine, everything normal. Though when I looked in the bathroom mirror, my reflection seemed slightly delayed, like there was a fraction of a second between my movement and the mirror's response. But that's just perception. When you're tired, your brain processes visual information more slowly. I didn't have any trouble falling asleep. The bed was comfortable, the room was quiet, the temperature was just right. Though I do remember that my dreams were unusually vivid that night. Not nightmares exactly, but very detailed, very specific dreams about places I had never been. Rooms with blue walls and metal fixtures, corridors that stretched longer than they should have, spaces that felt both familiar and completely foreign. But dreams are just random neural activity. The brain processes the day's experiences and creates narratives that don't necessarily mean anything. The fact that I could remember so many details was probably just a sign that I was sleeping more lightly than usual. Stress can affect sleep patterns and make dreams more memorable. I woke up at my usual time, feeling rested and normal. The alarm clock showed the correct time. The room looked exactly as it should. Though when I got up to open the curtains, I noticed that the window was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just cracked enough to let in a small breeze. But I always keep the windows closed at night. I must have opened it before going to bed and forgotten about it. Memory gaps are common when you're establishing routine behaviors. The morning proceeded normally. Shower, breakfast, getting dressed for work, everything exactly as it should be. Though when I went outside to get in my car, I noticed that the dew on the windshield had formed patterns that looked almost like handprints. Not clear impressions, just areas where the moisture had collected differently, but dew forms based on temperature differentials and air currents. It's not unusual for it to create random patterns that might resemble familiar shapes. I drove to work without incident. Same route, same traffic patterns, same routine. Though I did notice that the parking garage seemed different in the daylight, brighter, more open, less confusing. The shadows that had seemed so pronounced the night before were barely visible. Natural light changes everything. What seems mysterious at night usually has a perfectly reasonable explanation in the morning. The day proceeded normally. Work was routine, meetings were productive, everything functioned exactly as it should. Though I did find myself thinking about the previous evening more than I usually reflect on mundane events, not because anything significant had happened, but because the details seemed unusually clear in my memory, like my brain had recorded everything with higher resolution than normal. But that's just how memory works sometimes. Certain experiences, even routine ones, get encoded more vividly for reasons that aren't always clear. Probably because I was tired, my mind was more focused on immediate sensory input instead of filtering out unimportant details. It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon. I'm sure tonight will be completely normal. There's no reason to expect anything different. The parking garage will be empty, the elevator will work properly, my car will start without problems. I'll drive home through quiet streets, unlock my front door, and go through my usual evening routine. Everything will be exactly as it should be. Though I did notice that the printer this morning produced another stack of papers that were slightly misaligned. Not dramatically, just enough to be noticeable. The corners don't quite match up and the text seems to drift slightly from page to page, but that's just a mechanical issue. Old equipment develops quirks over time. There's probably nothing wrong that a simple adjustment couldn't fix. I haven't mentioned it to anyone because there's really nothing to mention. Nothing unusual happened, nothing worth discussing. Just a normal evening, a normal night, a normal morning. The kind of routine experience that everyone has countless times without giving it a second thought. But I do keep thinking about that coffee cup in the parking booth, how the steam rose in such a perfectly straight line, and the way my footsteps seemed to echo with more sounds than I was making, and how the shadows between the streetlights looked so solid, so deliberately placed. These are just details, meaningless observations that stuck in my memory for no particular reason. Tonight I'll probably take the same route home, park in the same space, walk through the same empty garage. The fluorescent lights will hum with their usual electrical noise, casting the same harsh illumination across the concrete surfaces. My footsteps will echo normally, creating the standard acoustic patterns you'd expect in an enclosed space. And if I happen to notice anything that seems slightly different, slightly off, I'll know it's just perception. Just the way tired minds create significance where none exists. Just the natural human tendency to find patterns in randomness, meaning in coincidence, intention in accident. Because nothing happened that night, nothing at all. Though I can't quite shake the feeling that tonight, when I walk to my car, the elevator might take just a little longer to arrive. Equals. Story 4. The switch didn't respond. My finger hovered, caught between habit and disbelief, waiting for the familiar, reassuring click that never came. I stepped inside, feet tracing the familiar path across the carpet that felt unnaturally flat, as if devoid of memory. The walls seemed to lean back, refusing to resonate my presence. Passing the mantel, I paused, expecting the subtle warmth of the air, the kind that houses always breathe. But the room exhaled nothing, and I hesitated, feeling the floor beneath me, questioning its solidity, my weight seemingly absorbed by absence. I'm trying to remember what happened after that. The doctors say memory works in fragments when trauma disrupts the neural pathways, but they don't understand how these pieces feel when they surface. Like broken glass catching light at different angles. Some cuts are sharp and immediate, others reflect nothing at all. I keep a journal now, the therapist suggested it. But when I write, the words feel like they belong to someone else, someone who lived through events I can only glimpse through thick fog. The handwriting looks familiar, though. That's something, I suppose. There was a hum. I remember the hum more clearly than my own face in the mirror that morning. It started low, somewhere beneath the floorboards, vibrating through the soles of my feet and climbing my spine like fingers made of electricity. The sound had weight, physical presence. It pressed against my eardrums from the inside, as if my skull had become a resonating chamber. But when did the hum begin? Before I entered the room, after the switch failed. I can't place it in any sequence that makes sense. Time feels scrambled, like someone shuffled the pages of my life and handed them back in the wrong order. The carpet was beige, or maybe gray. Memory has a way of draining color from things, leaving only impressions of texture and temperature. My bare feet remember the synthetic fibers, each strand pressing upward against my skin with unnatural persistence. Why was I barefoot? I always wore shoes indoors, always. The thought of walking on carpet without protection made my skin crawl, yet there I was, feeling every artificial thread through naked soles. My shoes were by the door, black leather still warm from my feet, laces loosened but not untied. They sat there like abandoned shells, positioned too perfectly, as if someone had arranged them while I wasn't looking. But I don't remember removing them. I don't remember the moment my feet touched the floor. The mantel held photographs. I know this because I can see their frames in my peripheral vision, silver rectangles catching light that shouldn't exist in a room where the switch didn't work. But when I try to focus on the images themselves, they blur into indistinct shapes, faces that might be familiar, smiles that could belong to anyone. My brain refuses to process the details, as if protecting me from something too painful to acknowledge. There was a door across the room, heavy wood, painted white but showing chips near the handle where countless hands had gripped and turned. The door was closed, but light leaked from beneath it, a thin golden line that pulsed with the rhythm of the hum. That light shouldn't have been there. The room beyond was supposed to be empty, had been empty for months. Or years. Time becomes elastic when memory fails. Events stretch and compress without warning. What felt like minutes might have been hours. What seemed like yesterday could have been decades ago. I approached the door, though I can't remember deciding to move. My feet carried me forward while my mind remained frozen, watching from a distance as my hand reached for the handle. The metal was warm, too warm, like fever-hot skin, pulsing with circulation that brass shouldn't possess. The handle turned without resistance, though I expected it to be locked. Expected the familiar frustration of finding barriers where none should exist. Instead, the mechanism moved smoothly, silently, as if recently oiled by invisible hands. But did I actually open the door? The memory fractures here, splitting into multiple possibilities that exist simultaneously in my mind. In one version, I pushed the door wide and stepped through. In another, I stood paralyzed, unable to cross the threshold. In a third, the door opened itself, revealing what lay beyond without any action on my part. All three memories feel equally real, equally false. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Copper and ozone, the scent of electrical storms and fresh blood. It filled my nostrils, coated my throat, seeped into my pores until I could taste it on my tongue. The odor was wrong, impossible, a combination that shouldn't exist in any natural environment. But when, before the door opened, after, the smell exists in my memory without temporal anchor, floating free from cause and effect like smoke in still air. My reflection caught my eye, though I can't remember seeing a mirror. The face looking back wasn't quite right, features slightly displaced, as if viewed through water or heat shimmer. My eyes were too wide, pupils dilated despite the golden light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. My mouth hung open, though I couldn't recall speaking or breathing heavily. The reflection moved independently, I think, turned its head when mine remained still, smiled when I felt nothing but growing dread. But mirrors don't work that way. Reflections follow, they don't lead, unless the person in the mirror isn't a reflection at all. Unless I'm the reflection. The thought makes my skin crawl even now, weeks or months later as I write these words. The possibility that I was watching myself from the wrong side of reality, that the person I thought I was had somehow become the echo rather than the source. I found myself in the kitchen, though I don't remember walking there. The transition was seamless, like editing in a film where scenes jump without explanation. One moment I was facing the door with its impossible light, the next I stood before the sink, cold water running over my hands. The water was red, not rust-colored or brown from old pipes, but bright arterial red that swirled down the drain in patterns too complex for random flow. My hands were clean, though, pale and unmarked, with no explanation for the colored water that poured over them. I turned off the faucet, but the water continued flowing. The handle spun uselessly in my grip, disconnected from any mechanism that might control the flow. The red stream maintained constant pressure, defying physics and plumbing both. That's when I saw the figure in the backyard. Through the kitchen window, standing motionless beside the garden shed, was a person I should have recognized. The silhouette was familiar, the posture achingly known, but their face remained hidden in shadow despite the brightness of the day beyond the glass. Was it day? The quality of light suggested noon, harsh and white, casting sharp shadows that cut across the lawn like black knives. But I remember entering the house in darkness, fumbling for a switch that wouldn't respond. Time had shifted again, jumping forward or backward without warning. The figure raised one hand in greeting or warning. The gesture was ambiguous, frozen at the moment between hello and stop, between welcome and threat. They held the position without movement, without breathing, like a statue carved from living flesh. I waved back, though I'm not sure why. Some social reflex that operated independently of conscious thought. My arm lifted, my hand moved side to side, while my mind screamed warnings about engaging with something that shouldn't exist. The figure didn't respond to my wave, didn't acknowledge the returned gesture in any way. They simply stood there, hand raised, watching through the window with eyes I couldn't see but felt boring into my skull. I blinked and they were gone. Not moved away or hidden behind the shed, simply absent as if they had never been there at all. The yard was empty, showing no signs of disturbance, no footprints in the soft earth where the figure had stood. But the impression remained. The weight of their gaze lingered on my skin like phantom touch, raising goosebumps despite the warm air that flowed from the heating vents. The vents, when had the heat come on, the house had been cold when I entered, cold enough to see my breath in small puffs of vapor. Now warm air circulated freely, carrying scents of dust and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't identify. I checked the thermostat, though I don't remember deciding to leave the kitchen. The device showed a temperature setting I hadn't chosen, numbers that made no sense for the season or my preferences. The display flickered between readings, showing temperatures that climbed steadily higher despite the comfortable air around me. 80 degrees, 90, 100 and climbing. But I felt no increase in heat. If anything, the air seemed to cool as the numbers rose, creating a disconnect between measurement and sensation that made my head spin. The phone rang, though I couldn't locate the source of the sound. The ring echoed from multiple directions, as if every room contained a device demanding attention. I followed the sound through hallways that seemed longer than they should be, past doors I didn't remember and windows that showed views of places I'd never seen. When I finally found a phone, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was complete, absolute, as if the house had suddenly been sealed inside a vacuum. No ambient noise, no electrical hum, no settling of wood or whisper of air through vents. I lifted the receiver anyway. The plastic was warm against my ear, and I could hear breathing on the other end. Slow, measured breaths that matched my own rhythm exactly. When I inhaled, the sound inhaled. When I held my breath, the line went silent. "Hello," I said, though my voice sounded strange, distorted as if filtered through water or thick glass. The breathing continued, perfectly synchronized with my own respiratory pattern. No response, no acknowledgement of my words, just the intimate sound of someone else's lungs filling and emptying in perfect harmony with mine. I hung up, but the breathing continued, not from the phone, which sat silent in its cradle, but from somewhere inside my own head. The sound of lungs that weren't my own, drawing air through passages that didn't exist in any anatomy I understood. The photographs on the mantel had changed. I'm certain of this, though I can't explain how or when the transformation occurred. The frames remained the same, but the images inside showed scenes I didn't recognize, places I'd never been, people whose faces were almost familiar but not quite right, as if someone had taken photographs of strangers and altered them slightly to suggest false connections. In one frame, I saw myself standing in a field of tall grass, but my face was wrong. Too young or too old, features shifted just enough to create unease rather than recognition. The background showed a landscape that existed nowhere in my memory, under a sky the color of old brass. Another photograph showed a dinner table set for two, with plates of food that looked freshly served. Steam rose from covered dishes, and wine glasses held liquid that caught light like liquid rubies. But both chairs were empty, and the food showed signs of decay despite the apparent freshness. Mold crept across bread, and the wine had separated into distinct layers of color that shouldn't exist in any natural vintage. I reached for the frame, wanting to examine the image more closely, but my hand passed through the glass as if it were made of air. The photograph remained untouched while my fingers encountered nothing but empty space where solid matter should have been. This is where my memory becomes most fragmented, most unreliable. The events that followed exist in my mind as impressions rather than clear recollections, like trying to remember a dream after waking. I was in the basement, though I don't recall descending stairs. The space was larger than it should have been, extending beyond the footprint of the house above. Concrete walls stretched into darkness that swallowed the beam of a flashlight I don't remember bringing. The hum was stronger here, not just audible but tactile, vibrating through the floor and walls until my entire body resonated with the frequency. My teeth ached from the vibration, and my vision blurred as my eyes shook in their sockets. Something moved in the darkness beyond my light, not walking or crawling, but flowing like liquid shadow given form and purpose. The movement was too smooth for any living thing, too purposeful for mere shadow. It approached with patience that suggested intelligence, awareness, intent. I tried to run, but my feet had rooted to the concrete floor, not physically trapped, but held by a paralysis that began in my mind and spread through my nervous system like slow poison. I could only watch as the darkness drew closer, bringing with it the scent of copper and ozone that had followed me through the house. The thing spoke without words, communicated through vibrations that bypassed my ears and went directly to the parts of my brain that process language. The message was simple, repeated over and over until it became the only thought I could hold. You were never supposed to leave. But leave what? When had I arrived? The questions multiplied faster than answers, creating a cascade of confusion that threatened to drown rational thought. I was back in the living room, standing before the mantel as if I'd never moved. The photographs showed normal scenes now. Family gatherings, vacation snapshots, the ordinary documentation of a life I thought I recognized. But the faces in the images were strangers, and the locations were places I'd never been. The switch worked when I tried it again. Light flooded the room, harsh and artificial, revealing details I hadn't noticed in the darkness. Dust patterns on surfaces suggested the house had been empty for a long time. Months, maybe years. But I remembered living here, remembered daily routines and familiar comforts. Didn't I? The certainty crumbled as I examined it. Memories that had felt solid moments before revealed themselves as constructions, elaborate fictions built on foundations of wishful thinking and desperate need for continuity. I found a calendar on the kitchen counter. The pages showed dates that made no sense, months out of sequence, years that contradicted each other from page to page. Someone had marked certain days with red ink, creating patterns that suggested significance without revealing meaning. The marks formed shapes when viewed from a distance, not random scribbles but deliberate designs that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Symbols that belonged to no alphabet I recognized, yet somehow conveyed meaning at a level below conscious understanding. My name was written on the final page, but the handwriting wasn't mine. The letters were too precise, too controlled, formed by someone who had studied my penmanship and reproduced it with mechanical accuracy. Below my name was a single word in the same false handwriting. Welcome. But welcome to what and from whom? The questions echo in my mind even now, as I write these fragments in an attempt to impose order on chaos. The journal pages fill with words that feel increasingly foreign, as if they're being dictated by someone else who merely borrows my hand to form the letters. I've been here before, written these same words, asked these same questions, reached these same non-conclusions. The journal contains multiple versions of this account, each slightly different, each ending at the same point of frustrated incomprehension. How many times have I lived through these events? How many times have I forgotten and remembered and forgotten again? The photographs change when I'm not watching. The calendar rearranges itself. The switch sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, depending on factors I can't identify or predict. But the hum remains constant, always there just below the threshold of conscious awareness, waiting for moments of quiet to assert itself. It's growing stronger, I think, more insistent. The vibrations penetrate deeper, reaching parts of my brain that shouldn't respond to sound. Something is waking up, something that has been dormant for a very long time, waiting for the right conditions to resume whatever purpose it serves. I can feel it stirring in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps where memory fails and imagination fills the void with terrors too specific to be random. The figure in the backyard appears more frequently now, sometimes by the shed, sometimes closer to the house, occasionally pressed against the kitchen window with palms flat against the glass. Their face remains hidden, but I can see my own reflection in the dark lenses of their eyes. Or maybe they're not wearing glasses. Maybe those dark circles are something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in any human face. I should leave, pack whatever belongings I can identify as truly mine and find somewhere else to live. But when I try to imagine life outside this house, my mind encounters blank space. No memories of other places, no connections to the wider world, no sense of identity that exists independently of these walls and their impossible contents. This is where I belong, apparently, where I've always belonged. The thought brings no comfort, only the cold certainty of a trap closing around prey that never realized it was being hunted. The words are coming faster now, flowing from my pen without conscious direction. My handwriting is changing, becoming more like the false signature in the calendar, more controlled and mechanical with each sentence. Soon, I won't be able to tell the difference between my thoughts and the thoughts being written through me. The hum is rising in pitch and volume. The photographs are cycling through images too quickly to process. The figure in the backyard is walking toward the house with steps that leave no footprints but shake the ground beneath my feet. Something has awakened and the memories are growing stronger. Equals. Story 5. It wasn't unusual for the lights in the hallway to flicker late at night. Sometimes they buzzed, a low hum that went unnoticed by most. The mail sat on the table, unopened, as if waiting for someone who no longer came home. I noticed the window latch was slightly loose but didn't bother fixing it. The refrigerator hummed quietly, masking what lay beyond its door, where a photo was missing from its magnet. I watched the clock tick past midnight, its hands gliding smoothly, dismissing the weight of silence. I stepped over the scuff marks on the floor, avoiding the smudges that had appeared overnight. When I passed the hallway mirror, I straightened it without glancing at my reflection. The flickering continued, but I left the light on as always. Something happened to me. I know this with the same certainty that I know my own breathing, yet I can't grasp what it was. The knowing sits heavy in my chest, like a stone I've swallowed that refuses to digest. I've been different since then, though I struggle to define how. My reflection seems to lag behind my movements by fractions of seconds. Food tastes like it's been filtered through cotton. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by the sensation that I'm being observed through my own eyes. The gaps in my memory aren't clean cuts. They're more like tears in fabric with frayed edges that catch on nothing. I remember the before and the after, but the during exists only as impressions, shadows that moved wrong, a sound like breathing through electronic static, the smell of new plastic mixed with something metallic and cold. I've started keeping a voice recorder by my bed, not because I talk in my sleep, but because sometimes I wake up with words on my tongue that aren't mine. The syllables feel foreign, like trying to speak underwater. I press record and whisper whatever fragments surface, hoping that hearing them back might unlock something deeper. Yesterday I found a file on my phone that I don't remember creating. The timestamp places it during those missing hours, but the audio is mostly static, punctuated by what sounds like my own voice saying things I can't quite make out. When I amplify the recording, there are other sounds underneath. A rhythmic tapping, the whisper of fabric against fabric, and something else, something that makes my skin crawl when I focus on it too intently. The first fragment came back while I was listening to that recording. Not a memory exactly, more like watching someone else's dream through fogged glass. I was standing in my kitchen, but the proportions were wrong. The ceiling stretched too high, and the walls seemed to breathe with a subtle, organic rhythm. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, but harmonized with frequencies that human ears shouldn't detect. There were lights, not the steady glow of bulbs, but something that pulsed and shifted like living tissue. They cast shadows that moved independently of their sources, reaching toward me with finger-like projections. I tried to step back, but my feet felt rooted to the floor, as if the linoleum had grown soft and was holding me in place. I could hear voices then, layered and distorted like a radio picking up multiple stations at once. They spoke in unison, but not quite in sync, creating an echo effect that made individual words impossible to distinguish. The sound seemed to come from inside my own head, vibrating through my skull until my teeth ached. That's where the first fragment ends. I'm left with the taste of copper and the lingering sensation that someone had been standing directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt their breath on my neck. I've been carrying a small object in my pocket since then. I found it on my nightstand, though I have no memory of placing it there. It's smooth and warm like polished stone, but it vibrates intermittently with a pulse that doesn't match my heartbeat. Sometimes when I hold it, I catch glimpses of things that might be memories or might be something else entirely. The second fragment arrived while I was washing dishes. My hands were submerged in soapy water when suddenly the kitchen plunged into darkness. Not the gradual dimming of a failing bulb, but an instantaneous absence of light so complete it felt solid. I could still feel the warm water around my fingers, could still hear the gentle splash of my movements, but visually I might as well have been sealed inside a cave. That's when I became aware of the presence behind me. Not footsteps or breathing, but a weight in the air, a displacement that my body recognized even if my mind couldn't process it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and goosebumps raced down my arms despite the warm kitchen air. I tried to turn around, but my body wouldn't obey. My neck muscles strained against some invisible resistance, as if the air itself had thickened into amber. I could only stand there, hands still submerged, while whatever was behind me moved closer. I felt no breath, no body heat, but somehow I knew it was examining me, studying me with an attention so intense it felt like being dissected. Then came the sound, not quite mechanical, not quite organic, like the whir of machinery filtered through vocal cords or the whisper of wind through structures that shouldn't exist. It rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost like language, but no language I'd ever heard. The rhythm was hypnotic, and I found myself leaning into it, my consciousness beginning to drift. The lights returned as suddenly as they'd vanished, and I was alone again. But the water in the sink had turned cold, and my hands were pruned as if I'd been standing there for hours. On the counter beside me sat that smooth, warm object, though I was certain it hadn't been there before. Since then, strange things have been happening in the present, small distortions that make me question whether the event, whatever it was, has truly ended. My reflection in the bathroom mirror sometimes moves a beat behind my actual motions, like a badly dubbed film. I'll catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there except the familiar furniture of my home. The sounds are worse, electronic whispers that seem to emanate from the walls themselves. Static that resolves into almost words before dissolving back into white noise. Sometimes I hear that same rhythmic tapping from the phone recording, coming from inside the walls or beneath the floorboards. When I press my ear to the surface, the sound stops, but I can feel vibrations continuing through the structure of the house. I've started finding notes written in my own handwriting, tucked into books or folded inside drawers. The words are mine, but I don't remember writing them. They describe sensations and experiences that feel familiar yet impossible. The air tastes like copper pennies, and tomorrow, one reads. Another simply says, they're still watching through the spaces between seconds. The final fragment came to me while I was holding that warm object, pressing it against my temple like a compress. The memory, if that's what it was, arrived with startling clarity, more vivid than anything I'd experienced before. I was in my bedroom, but it wasn't my bedroom. The walls were the same color, the furniture arranged identically, but everything was somehow more present, more real, as if normal reality had been a faded photocopy and this was the original. The air shimmered with barely visible currents, and I could see layers of existence stacked like transparent sheets, each one containing a slightly different version of the same scene. Standing at the foot of my bed were figures that my mind struggles to retain, not because they were unclear, but because they were too clear, too perfectly defined in ways that human perception isn't equipped to process. They observed me with an attention that felt like being read, like having every thought and memory examined and catalogued. One of them moved closer, and I could see that it wasn't walking so much as flowing, its form shifting between states of matter as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions in its presence. When it reached out toward me, I felt a sensation like cold electricity running through my nervous system, and suddenly I could understand the purpose of their attention. They weren't just observing me, they were editing me, removing certain experiences, certain knowledge, and replacing it with carefully constructed gaps. I could feel pieces of myself being lifted away, stored somewhere I couldn't reach, while new patterns of thought were gently inserted into the spaces they'd left behind. The process should have been terrifying, but instead I felt a profound calm, as if I were finally coming home after a long journey. My consciousness began to fragment, splitting into multiple streams that flowed in different directions. Part of me remained in the bedroom, watching the procedure with detached fascination. Another part drifted through landscapes that existed between thoughts, where geometry followed emotional logic and colors had texture. But there was a third part, a small core of awareness that they either couldn't reach or chose to leave intact. This fragment observed everything, recorded everything, and then buried itself so deeply in my psyche that even I couldn't access it directly. It's this hidden observer that's been feeding me these fragments, these glimpses of what was taken away. The memory ends there, but the implications stretch forward into my current reality. Because if they edited me once, who's to say they aren't still editing me? These fragments I'm recovering, are they genuine memories or carefully planted suggestions designed to make me think I'm remembering? I've noticed that the warm object in my pocket has been growing warmer, its vibrations more frequent and intense. Sometimes I catch myself speaking in that foreign tongue, the syllables flowing from my mouth like water while my conscious mind scrambles to understand what I'm saying. My reflection has been lagging more noticeably, and yesterday I saw it blink while my eyes were open. The static in the walls has resolved into something that almost sounds like conversation, as if multiple voices are discussing me in frequencies just below human hearing. When I press my ear to the surface, I can almost make out individual words, but they slip away like mist whenever I try to focus on them. I found another note this morning, folded inside my coffee mug. In my own handwriting, it simply read, "The editing never stopped, you're still on the table." Below that, in letters so small I needed a magnifying glass to read them, "What makes you think you ever left the bedroom?" I don't know if I'm remembering or if I'm still dreaming. I don't know if these fragments are glimpses of truth or carefully constructed lies designed to keep me distracted while something else happens in the spaces I can't perceive. The warm object pulses against my leg, and I can feel my thoughts beginning to scatter again, drawn toward that hypnotic rhythm that sounds like breathing through electronic static. Sometimes I catch myself staring at the flickering hallway light, and I wonder if I ever actually left that moment. If everything since then, all these fragments and investigations and growing awareness, is just another layer of the editing process. A story I'm being allowed to tell myself while the real work continues in the background. The mirror in the hallway is crooked again, and this time I'm afraid to straighten it. Because what if my reflection isn't there anymore? What if it's still standing in that other bedroom, watching those figures work on a version of me that never learned to forget? The recording device by my bed clicked on by itself last night. When I played it back, I heard my own voice speaking in that underwater language for 17 minutes straight. But I was awake the entire night, and I never said a word. Who is speaking through my mouth while I sleep with my eyes open? Equals. Dory 6. The low thud repeated itself, persistent yet strangely distant, while my breath stayed silent, blending with the stillness of the room. To my right, the curtain fluttered without any breeze, an unnatural ripple caught in the corner of my eye. The sound came again, each knock spaced perfectly, a rhythm that seemed deliberate yet illogical. The air was thick with anticipation, every fiber of my being alert to the ambiguity around. My gaze remained fixed on the doorframe, but its edges remained unyielding, unchanged. A disquieting echo lingered just beyond the reach of clarity. Then subtly the painting on the wall, untouched for years, swayed minutely on its nail, as if acknowledging an unseen presence that slipped past me unnoticed. I'm trying to piece it together now. The fragments come in waves, washing over me when I least expect them. Sometimes I'm in the middle of washing dishes, and suddenly I'm back there, wherever there was. The water runs cold over my hands, and I remember another kind of cold, a different kind of silence. The thudding, that's where it starts always, but I don't know where it ends. I've been writing things down, trying to make sense of the pieces. My handwriting looks different now, shakier, like my fingers remember something my mind refuses to hold on to. The pen feels heavy between my thumb and forefinger, and sometimes I catch myself pressing too hard into the paper, leaving deep grooves that show through 3 pages beneath. There was a room, I think there was a room. The walls were the color of old milk, that yellowish white that speaks of neglect, or maybe they were blue. Blue like the inside of a freezer, cold and artificial. My memory shifts when I try to pin it down, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The curtain moved again, I remember that clearly. It shouldn't have moved. There was no window open, no air conditioning running, no reason for fabric to ripple like that. But it did, over and over. A gentle wave motion that hypnotized me into staring until my eyes watered. I can smell metal, even now, sitting in my kitchen with the morning light streaming through clean windows. I smell it. Sharp and bitter, like coins left too long in a pocket. It coats the back of my throat and makes me swallow reflexively. Sometimes I wake up with that taste in my mouth, and I have to brush my teeth 3 times before it fades. The painting, I need to talk about the painting. It was a landscape, I think, rolling hills or maybe mountains in the distance. The kind of generic artwork you find in waiting rooms or cheap hotels. But it moved, not dramatically, not like in some ghost story, just a tiny shift, a barely perceptible sway that caught my peripheral vision. I stood there watching it for what felt like hours. My neck began to ache from craning upward, but I couldn't look away. The frame was dark wood, scratched along the bottom edge. There was a small chip in the corner where the paint had flaked off, revealing raw wood underneath. These details feel more real than anything else, more real than my own thoughts. The thudding stopped, that's important somehow. The rhythm that had been so consistent, so reliable, just ceased. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. It pressed against my eardrums like water pressure, making me want to pop my jaw or swallow hard to relieve it. I remember touching the wall, my palm flat against the surface, feeling for vibrations. The paint was slightly rough under my skin, textured in a way that suggested multiple coats applied over many years, but there was something else, a warmth that didn't make sense. The room felt cold, but the wall was warm, body warm, fever warm. My reflection in the window glass looked wrong, not dramatically different, just off somehow. Like a photograph that's been slightly overexposed, washing out the details and leaving everything pale and indistinct. I touched my face to make sure I was still solid, still there. My cheek felt cold under my fingertips. The air grew thick, that's how I remember it. Not humid, not heavy with moisture, but dense, like trying to breathe through fabric. Each inhale required effort, and I found myself taking smaller, shallower breaths to compensate. My chest felt tight, constricted, as if invisible hands were pressing against my ribs. There was someone else there. I think there was someone else there. A figure in my peripheral vision, never quite in focus when I turned to look directly. Always just outside the range of clear sight. Static, motionless, but undeniably present. I called out, my voice sounded strange in that space, muffled and flat. The words seemed to die just inches from my lips, absorbed by the thick air. No echo, no response, just the sound of my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. The door frame never changed. I keep coming back to that detail. Despite everything else shifting and moving and behaving in ways that defied logic, the doorframe remained constant, solid, reliable. I found myself focusing on it like an anchor, something real and normal in a situation that felt increasingly unreal. But was it a doorframe? The more I try to remember, the less certain I become. It might have been a window frame or the edge of a mirror. The shape is clear in my memory, but the context keeps slipping away like smoke. I can feel my pulse in my wrists when I think about it, a steady throb that matches the rhythm of the thudding. Thud thud, thud thud, thud thud, my heart trying to keep time with something that may not have been real. The curtain was white or cream colored, thin enough that light passed through it, creating shifting patterns on the floor. But there was no light source that I could identify. No lamp, no overhead fixture, no sunlight streaming through a window. The illumination seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, casting no shadows despite the obstacles in its path. I touched the fabric once. It felt like cotton, soft and slightly worn. But when I pulled my hand away, my fingers were cold, colder than they should have been. Cold enough that I rubbed them together to restore circulation, watching my skin slowly return to its normal color. The scent of overheated electronics fills my nostrils now as I write this. That distinctive smell of circuits pushed beyond their limits, plastic beginning to melt, metal expanding in the heat. But there were no electronics in that room, at least none that I could see. I keep checking the painting in my own house now, the one hanging above my couch, a gift from someone whose name I can't quite recall. It hangs perfectly straight, never moving, never swaying. But I catch myself staring at it anyway, waiting for that telltale shift that would confirm I'm not losing my mind. The figure was wearing dark clothes. I think they were wearing dark clothes, a jacket or sweater, something with long sleeves, but their face remains a blur, a smudge in my memory that refuses to come into focus no matter how hard I concentrate. Sometimes I think they were tall, sometimes I think they were short. The details shift like sand. My feet were cold, the floor was cold beneath my feet. Tile, maybe, or polished concrete, something hard and unforgiving that conducted heat away from my body. I remember shifting my weight from foot to foot, trying to stay warm, trying to maintain circulation. The thudding resumed, after the silence, after the waiting, after the growing certainty that it had stopped forever. It began again. Same rhythm, same intensity, same mysterious source, but this time it seemed closer, more immediate, as if whatever was creating the sound had moved nearer while I wasn't paying attention. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to locate the source. The surface was smooth and cool against my skin, and I could feel the vibrations more than hear them. A steady pulse that seemed to originate from somewhere deep within the structure itself, like a heartbeat, like something alive trapped inside the walls. The painting swayed again, larger this time, more obvious. The landscape tilted to the left, then slowly righted itself, as if the building had shifted beneath it. But I felt no movement under my feet, no tremor or vibration that would explain such motion. I'm losing time when I think about this. I start writing in the morning and suddenly it's afternoon. The sun has moved across the sky without my noticing, and my coffee has grown cold in its cup. My hand cramps from gripping the pen too tightly, and there are pages of words I don't remember forming. The air tasted metallic, like blood but not quite, more like the taste you get when you bite down on aluminum foil, that sharp electric sensation that makes your teeth ache. It coated my tongue and made swallowing difficult. There was a hum, low and constant, just at the edge of hearing, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else goes quiet. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a vibration that penetrated bone and settled in my skull. Even now, in the silence of my kitchen, I can still hear it. The figure moved, just once, just slightly, but I saw it. A shift in posture, a turn of the head, something that confirmed they were aware of my presence. But when I looked directly at where they should have been, there was nothing, empty space, air. My reflection in the window had no face. I remember that now, suddenly and with perfect clarity. The outline of my head and shoulders, the familiar shape of my hair, but where my features should have been there was only smooth, blank skin, like looking at an unfinished portrait. The curtain stopped moving, the painting stopped swaying, the thudding stopped, everything became perfectly, unnaturally still. Even the air seemed to stop circulating, leaving me standing in a pocket of absolute motionlessness. I held my breath without meaning to, waiting, listening, feeling the silence press against my eardrums until they ached. My heart hammered in my chest, the only sound in a world that had gone completely quiet. Then something touched my shoulder. I can't remember what happened after that. The memory cuts off like a film reel snapping, leaving me with nothing but the sensation of fingers against my shirt, cold and impossibly light, like being touched by mist-given form. I've been having dreams, or maybe they're memories. I can't tell the difference anymore. I'm back in that room, watching the curtain move, listening to the thudding, feeling the thick air fill my lungs. But in the dreams, I can see the figure clearly. They're smiling. The taste of metal is stronger now. It's been growing more intense each day, each time I try to remember. My teeth ache constantly, and I find myself running my tongue over them obsessively, checking for damage that isn't there. I think something is waking up, inside me, around me, I can't tell which. The memories are becoming more vivid, more insistent. They push into my consciousness at random moments, demanding attention, demanding acknowledgement. The thudding has started again, not in the memory this time. Here in my house, in my kitchen where I sit writing these words, soft at first, barely audible but growing stronger, more persistent. The curtain by my window just moved. I'm going to stop writing now. Something is coming back, something I thought I had left behind in that room with the moving painting and the thick air and the figure in dark clothes. But it followed me home. The rhythm is getting stronger. Equals. Story 7. I told them I never left the kitchen. The conversation was brief, punctuated by the soft clatter of utensils, an everyday orchestra meant to distract. I could still feel the weight of the front door handle, cold and heavy, impressing a memory into my palm. The linoleum, worn at the edges, bore tiny specks that didn't belong, dark, irregular flecks that seemed to lead somewhere. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, masking the lingering scent of burnt matches hidden beneath the more familiar aromas. I didn't mention the draft that twisted through the room, shifting corners of the tablecloth, nor the faint echo of a closing door, but the chill in the air remained, persistent and accusing. The truth sits differently now, like sediment settling in still water. I understand why my hands shake when I reach for the matches, why the simple act of lighting the stove has become something I avoid. They believed me when I said I stayed inside, and perhaps that's what matters. But I know what I know, and the knowing has changed the shape of everything familiar. Just before they arrived, I had been standing at the sink, watching the water spiral down the drain. My reflection wavered in the window above, fractured by droplets that hadn't been there moments before. The kitchen felt smaller then, as if the walls had drawn closer while I wasn't paying attention. I remember pressing my palms against the counter, feeling the slight give in the laminate where it had begun to separate from the wood beneath. The sound of their car in the driveway had sent me scrambling, though I couldn't say why. My movements were automatic, rehearsed, as if I had practiced this moment. I swept the dark specks toward the corner with my foot, watching them scatter and regroup like tiny insects seeking shelter. The tablecloth required straightening, its corners precisely aligned, though I couldn't recall disturbing it. My shoes had been damp. I noticed this as I kicked them under the table. The leather darker than it should have been, marked with something that wasn't quite mud. The dampness had a particular quality, a weight that suggested more than morning dew. I flexed my toes inside my socks, feeling the slight chill that comes from moisture seeping through worn soles. Before that, I had been moving through the house with purpose, though the purpose feels distant now, like trying to remember a dream after waking. Each room had seemed different, charged with an energy that made the air feel thick. The floorboards creaked in places they had never creaked before, announcing my presence to empty rooms that somehow didn't feel empty. The front door had been open, not wide, just enough to let in the morning air and something else, something that rode alongside the breeze like a passenger. I had stood in the doorway, one foot inside, one foot on the threshold, caught between two worlds that suddenly seemed very different from each other. The handle was cold even then, colder than the metal should have been, as if it had been holding onto winter long past its time. Outside, the world had looked wrong, not dramatically, not in any way I could point to and name, but wrong nonetheless. The shadows fell at angles that seemed slightly off, and the silence was too complete, too carefully arranged. Even the birds had seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to conclude. I had walked to the edge of the property, my feet carrying me without conscious decision. The grass was wet, though no rain had fallen, and it clung to my shoes with unusual persistence. Each step left a mark that seemed deeper than it should have been, as if the earth itself was softer, more yielding than I remembered. The thing I had gone to see was still there, exactly where I had left it. It hadn't moved, couldn't move, yet something about its position suggested it had tried. The morning light fell across it in a way that made me squint, not from brightness but from something harder to define. I had knelt beside it, my knees pressing into the damp earth, and touched it once briefly, just to confirm what I already knew. The weight of it had surprised me, not heavy exactly, but dense in a way that seemed to pull at more than just my hands. I had lifted it carefully, cradling it against my chest, feeling its coolness seep through my shirt. The walk back to the house had seemed longer than the walk out, each step requiring more effort than the last. Inside, I had set it on the kitchen counter, next to the sink where the morning light would find it. It looked smaller there, diminished by the familiar surroundings, but no less significant. I had run water over my hands, watching the liquid carry away traces of earth and something else, something that left my skin feeling different, changed. The matches had been necessary then. I had struck one, then another, letting each flame burn down nearly to my fingers before blowing it out. The smell of sulfur had filled the kitchen, sharp and acrid, covering other scents that I didn't want to identify. The burnt matches had scattered across the counter, small casualties of my need to mask what couldn't be masked. But before all of that, before the walking and the finding and the careful return, there had been the sound. It had woken me, though I hadn't been sleeping deeply. A soft thud, muffled but distinct, coming from somewhere outside. I had lain in bed for a long moment, listening to the silence that followed, waiting for the sound to repeat or explain itself. When I finally rose and went to the window, the world outside had looked peaceful, undisturbed. Nothing moved in the pale light, nothing suggested that anything had changed. But the sound had been real, and it had come from the direction of the old tree, the one whose branches scraped against the house when the wind was strong. I had dressed quickly, quietly, though there was no one to wake. My movements were careful, deliberate, as if I understood even then that this moment would matter, that it would become the pivot point around which everything else would turn. The floorboards had been cold against my feet, and I had paused at each window, looking out, seeing nothing but feeling watched nonetheless. The back door had opened without its usual protest, as if it too understood the need for silence. The air outside had been still, heavy with moisture and the green smell of growing things. I had stepped onto the grass, feeling it yield beneath my weight, and walked toward the tree with the certainty of someone following a path they had walked many times before. And there, in the pale light of early morning, I had found what the sound had left behind. Small, still, and utterly wrong in its stillness. It had looked up at me with eyes that no longer saw, and I had known with a clarity that cut through the morning haze that everything had changed, that I had changed, that the simple act of finding this thing had made me complicit in its silence. The moment stretched, elastic and strange, as I stood looking down at what had fallen from the tree, or what had been placed there, or what had simply chosen that spot to stop moving forever. The distinction seemed important then, though I couldn't say why. I had reached down, my hand moving without permission from my mind, and touched the small, cold form. It had been warm once, recently warm. The knowledge of this came through my fingertips, a phantom heat that spoke of life recently departed. And in that touch, in that moment of contact, I had understood that I was no longer just a witness. I had become part of the story, woven into its fabric by the simple act of being there, of seeing, of knowing. The tree above had creaked softly, though no wind stirred its branches, and in that sound I had heard something like an ending or perhaps a beginning. The difference, I was learning, was often smaller than we imagine. Equals. Story 8. The light switch didn't respond. My fingers grazed it, expecting the familiar click, but met with an unnerving silence instead. The corridor stretched ahead, dim and unyielding, with walls that seemed to absorb rather than reflect any sound. My footsteps were phantom-like, barely audible, as if swallowed by the thick air. The carpet underfoot felt oddly smooth, its texture hiding secrets beneath my steps. I paused at the edge of the doorway. The frame seemed to hum with an inaudible frequency, holding its breath for what I couldn't yet understand. There's this sound that cuts through everything else when I try to sleep, a metallic whirring like machinery spinning inside the walls. It starts low, barely noticeable, then builds until my teeth ache from the vibration. Sometimes I press my ear against the wall, feeling the cool surface pulse against my cheek. The sound always stops the moment I touch it, leaving only the echo of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. I've checked every room, every corner, but the source remains hidden. The silence afterward feels heavier than the noise itself. I wasn't alone in that space. Something watched from the periphery of my vision, just beyond where I could turn my head fast enough to catch it. The air grew thick with presence, like standing too close to someone breathing down your neck. My skin prickled with the certainty of being observed, studied. When I closed my eyes, the feeling intensified, as if darkness made me more visible somehow. I remember trying to call out, but my voice came out as barely a whisper, absorbed by that same suffocating atmosphere. The watching never stopped, even when I convinced myself I was dreaming. My thoughts scattered like startled birds. One moment I was thinking about morning coffee, the next my mind filled with images I'd never seen before. Geometric patterns that hurt to remember, angles that folded in ways that made my vision blur. I'd find myself standing in rooms with no memory of walking there, my hand reaching for objects I didn't recognize. The boundary between my thoughts and something else grew thin, permeable. Words formed in my head that I'd never learned, in a rhythm that wasn't mine. I started writing them down, but the letters looked wrong on paper, like they belonged to a different alphabet entirely. The flash came without warning. Brilliant white light that didn't illuminate anything, just burned through my closed eyelids. In that moment, objects moved around me, rearranging themselves in patterns that defied logic. I felt my body lifting, weightless, while the ground beneath me shifted and rippled like water. There were sounds, mechanical and organic, blended together, creating harmonies that made my bones vibrate. When the light faded, everything looked the same but felt fundamentally altered. The air tasted metallic, charged with an energy that made my hair stand on end. The headache started 3 days later, not pain exactly, but pressure, like my skull was too small for what it contained. I'd catch glimpses of that corridor in reflective surfaces, superimposed over my normal surroundings. The smooth carpet texture would appear under my feet when I walked on hardwood floors. My hands would reach for light switches that worked perfectly, but I'd still feel that unnerving silence in my fingertips. Sleep became fragmented, filled with the sensation of walking through that dim space over and over, never reaching the end. But sometimes I remember it differently. The light switch worked fine, clicking on to reveal a perfectly ordinary hallway. My footsteps echoed normally against standard walls painted an unremarkable beige. The carpet had a typical rough texture, nothing unusual about it at all. I walked to the end without incident, turned around and walked back. Nothing watched me. No presence filled the air. The silence was just regular quiet, the kind you'd expect in any building after hours. This version feels just as real as the other, maybe more real, which is what disturbs me most. I've stopped trying to understand what happened in that corridor. The memories shift each time I examine them, like looking at something underwater that bends and wavers with each ripple. Some nights I dream of that metallic whirring, and I wake up with the taste of ozone on my tongue. Other nights I dream of perfect silence and wake up feeling like I've lost something important. The light switches in my home work exactly as they should, but I hesitate before touching them now. My fingers remember that unnerving silence, that moment when the familiar became foreign. Something changed in that space between expectation and reality, and I carry it with me now like a frequency I can't quite tune out. I don't want to remember any more than I already do. Equals. Story 9. The room had fallen into a quiet that felt unnatural, each creak from the ceiling above accentuating the weight of waiting. The dim light from the solitary bulb cast shadows that rippled across the floor, falling short of the far corner that seemed to resist illumination. I watched the space intently, noting how the ambient noises and occasional rustle from the leaves outside, a distant murmur of passing traffic, failed to drown out the silence within. The air was still, devoid of movement, suspending time itself as I strained to understand what lay just beyond perception. It was only when the faintest of breezes touched my skin, an impossibility in the closed room, that I felt the breath of something observing in return. Nothing happened that night. I want to make that clear from the start. I was tired, probably more tired than I realized, and when you're exhausted, your mind can play tricks on you. That's all it was, tricks of the mind. I didn't see anything unusual, didn't experience anything that couldn't be explained by simple fatigue and an overactive imagination. I remember going to bed at the usual hour. The house was quiet, just the way it always is. Maybe there was a slight chill in the air, but that's normal for this season. Houses settle, pipes make noise, floorboards creak under their own weight. These are facts, rational, explainable facts. I must have dozed off quickly because the next thing I knew I was awake. Not startled awake, mind you, just awake. It was probably just my body's natural sleep cycle adjusting itself. Sometimes you wake up in the middle of sleep for no reason at all. The room looked exactly the same as when I'd closed my eyes. The same familiar shapes, the same darkness pressing against the windows. Though I do remember thinking the darkness seemed thicker somehow, heavier, but that was just my eyes adjusting, or maybe clouds had moved across the moon. There are perfectly reasonable explanations for why darkness might appear more substantial at certain moments. It has to do with light pollution and atmospheric conditions, I'm sure. I didn't get up to investigate anything because there was nothing to investigate. I simply lay there, listening to the normal sounds of a house at rest, the heating system cycling on and off, the refrigerator humming downstairs. Maybe there was a sound like metal expanding, but that's what metal does when temperatures change. It expands and contracts, basic physics. Although the sound did seem to come from above rather than from the heating vents, and it had a different quality to it, like something large and hollow being gently tapped, but I'm sure it was just the ductwork. Old houses have complex ventilation systems, and sounds can travel in unexpected ways through walls and ceilings. I closed my eyes again, determined to get back to sleep. That's when I noticed the air had changed, not dramatically, just subtly. It felt denser, like before a storm, though the weather had been clear. Sometimes atmospheric pressure shifts overnight. It's a meteorological phenomenon that can affect sensitive people, make them feel restless or aware of their surroundings in unusual ways. The temperature seemed different too, warmer despite the chill I'd felt earlier. My skin felt warm, almost feverish, but I wasn't sick. I probably just had too many blankets, though I remember distinctly that I hadn't been using any blankets. I'd gone to bed with just the sheet because the room had felt comfortable, neither hot nor cold. I kept my eyes closed and tried to regulate my breathing, in through the nose, out through the mouth. A relaxation technique I'd learned somewhere, but my breathing felt strange, like the air was thicker than it should be, more substantial. Each breath seemed to take more effort, not because I was having trouble breathing, but because there was more to breathe, more substance in each lungful. That's when I became aware of the smell. Not a strong smell, just a faint metallic scent, like coins left in a warm pocket. It could have been anything. Maybe the heating system was burning off dust, or there was a minor electrical issue somewhere in the walls. Old wiring sometimes produces unusual odors when it gets warm. But the smell seemed to be coming from directly above me. from the ceiling, which didn't make sense because there's nothing above my bedroom except the attic, and the attic is empty, has been empty for years. Just insulation and old wooden beams and maybe some boxes of things I'd forgotten about. I didn't open my eyes to look up at the ceiling. There was no reason to. I knew what it looked like. White paint, slightly yellowed with age, a few hairline cracks near the corners where the house had settled. Nothing unusual about it. Nothing that would explain why I felt so aware of it suddenly, so conscious of its presence above me. The metallic smell grew stronger, but I'm sure that was just my imagination focusing on it. When you notice a smell, it often seems to intensify, even if it's actually staying the same. It's a psychological effect, the mind amplifying sensory input when attention is directed toward it. I tried to think about other things. Work tomorrow, errands I needed to run, mundane details that would help me drift back to sleep. But my attention kept returning to the space above me. Not because anything was happening there, but because my tired brain was fixated on it for some reason. That's when I heard the sound again, the gentle tapping like fingernails on metal, but slower than fingernails would be, more deliberate, each tap separated by several seconds of silence, as if whatever was making the sound was being very careful about the spacing. It was probably just thermal expansion in the pipes. Hot water pipes can make all sorts of sounds as they heat up and cool down. Tapping, clicking, even sounds that might seem almost rhythmic if you listen to them in a certain frame of mind. But the tapping seemed to be moving, starting from one side of the ceiling and slowly progressing across to the other side, which pipes don't do. Pipes are stationary. They're fixed in place by brackets and supports. They don't move around the ceiling in slow, measured patterns. I told myself it must be an animal. Sometimes squirrels or raccoons get into attics. They can make sounds that seem almost intelligent, almost purposeful. An animal moving across the attic floor could easily create the impression of deliberate tapping, especially if it was stepping carefully to avoid making too much noise. Though it seemed strange that an animal would move so slowly, so methodically. Animals are usually quick and erratic in their movements, especially when they're somewhere they shouldn't be. This sounded more patient, more considered. The tapping stopped directly above my head, right above the center of the bed where I was lying. If it was an animal, it had apparently found whatever it was looking for, or maybe it was resting. Animals do rest, even in unfamiliar places. I waited for the sound to resume, to continue across the ceiling and eventually fade away as the animal moved to another part of the attic. But it didn't resume. The silence stretched on, but it wasn't the comfortable silence from earlier. This silence felt occupied, full of attention. My skin began to feel strange, not painful, just strange, like a very mild electrical current was running across the surface. The kind of sensation you might get from static electricity, except it was constant rather than a brief shock. It started at my scalp and slowly spread downward. Static electricity can build up in dry conditions, especially in older houses with poor humidity control. It's a perfectly normal phenomenon. Sometimes you can feel it accumulating on your skin before it discharges. That must have been what I was experiencing. But the sensation was too uniform, too gentle. Static electricity usually feels sharp and unpredictable. This felt more like being very lightly touched all over, as if the air itself had developed texture, as if invisible fingers were barely grazing every inch of my skin simultaneously. I didn't move. There was no reason to move. I was comfortable in bed, and moving would only disturb whatever natural process was causing these minor sensations. better to remain still and let everything settle back to normal. That's when I became aware of the light, not a bright light, not even a visible light exactly, more like the memory of light or the suggestion of light. The darkness behind my closed eyelids seemed less complete than it had been, less absolute. Sometimes your eyes create their own light when they're closed. Phosphenes, I think they're called, little sparks and patterns that your visual system generates when there's no actual light to process. It's a neurological quirk, nothing more. But this felt different from phosphenes. It felt external. Like there was actually something glowing softly above me, something that was producing just enough light to register on my closed eyelids without being bright enough to see clearly. The metallic smell was stronger now, definitely stronger, and warmer, as if whatever was producing it was heating up, like metal left in sunlight, except there was no sunlight. The room was dark, the house was dark, everything was dark except for this subtle suggestion of illumination that I couldn't quite identify. I felt my heart rate increase slightly, but that was probably just from lying still for so long. When you're motionless for extended periods, sometimes your circulation changes and your heart compensates by beating a little faster. It's a normal physiological response. Though my heart seemed to be beating in rhythm with something else, something external, as if there was a very slow, very quiet pulse coming from above, and my own pulse was synchronizing with it. Like when you're in a room with a loud bass speaker and you can feel the vibrations in your chest. But there was no speaker, no music, no external source of rhythm that I could identify. Just this gentle, persistent pulse that seemed to be emanating from the ceiling and somehow influencing my own heartbeat. I should have opened my eyes then, should have sat up and looked around and confirmed that everything was normal, but I didn't want to, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I was comfortable, relaxed despite the strange sensations. Whatever was happening felt almost soothing in its strangeness. The warm electrical feeling on my skin intensified, and I had the distinct impression that something was very close to me, not touching me, but close enough that I could sense its presence. Like when someone leans over you while you're sleeping and you wake up aware of them before you open your eyes. But there was no one else in the house. I live alone, always have. The doors were locked, the windows were secure. There was no way anyone could be in the room with me. The sensation of presence was just my imagination, my tired mind creating phantom awareness where none existed. Still, the feeling was remarkably specific. I could sense exactly where this imaginary presence was positioned, directly above me, maybe 3 feet from the ceiling, hovering there in the empty air, motionless and attentive. I could almost feel the weight of its attention, the way you can feel someone watching you even when you can't see them. The light behind my eyelids grew slightly stronger, and I had the strangest thought that whatever was above me was glowing. Not like a bulb or a flame, but like something that was naturally luminescent. Something that produced its own soft, steady radiance without heat or flicker. Which was impossible, of course. There are very few things in nature that produce their own light, and none of them would be floating in my bedroom in the middle of the night. It had to be car headlights from outside, or maybe someone walking by with a flashlight. Light from an external source filtering through the windows and reflecting off the ceiling in unusual ways. But the quality of the light was wrong for headlights or flashlights. Too steady, too warm, too diffuse, and it seemed to be coming from above rather than from the sides where the windows were. I became aware that I was holding my breath, not intentionally, just unconsciously, as if some part of me was trying to be as quiet as possible, as unobtrusive as possible. the way you might hold your breath if you were hiding and didn't want to be discovered. But I wasn't hiding. I was in my own bed, in my own room, in my own house. There was nothing to hide from. The breath holding was probably just a side effect of the relaxed state I was in. Sometimes when people are very calm, their breathing naturally becomes slower and shallower. When I finally exhaled, the sound seemed unusually loud in the quiet room, and immediately after I exhaled, I heard something else exhale. A soft, slow release of air that came from somewhere above me. An echo, maybe, or the sound of air moving through the ventilation system in response to the slight pressure change I'd created. But it sounded too organic to be mechanical, too much like breathing to be anything other than breathing, as if something above me was matching my respiratory rhythm, inhaling when I inhaled, exhaling when I exhaled. I told myself it was coincidence. Houses make all sorts of sounds that can seem to correspond with your own movements and sounds. Acoustic phenomena can create the illusion of response where none exists. It's a form of pattern recognition, the mind finding connections that aren't really there. The breathing sound continued for several more cycles, perfectly synchronized with my own breathing. When I held my breath, it stopped. When I resumed breathing, it resumed. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, but there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe there was an animal in the attic after all, and it was somehow responding to the sounds I was making. Some animals are very sensitive to human presence and will modify their behavior accordingly, though I couldn't imagine what kind of animal would breathe so slowly and deliberately. The metallic smell was becoming overwhelming now, not unpleasant, but so strong that it seemed to coat the inside of my nose and mouth, like breathing air that had been filtered through copper pipes or standing too close to electrical equipment that was running hot. And underneath the metallic smell there was something else, something organic and warm, not quite familiar but not entirely foreign either, like the smell of skin but not human skin, something similar but different in ways I couldn't quite identify. I knew I should open my eyes. The rational part of my mind was insisting that I open my eyes and look around and confirm that everything was normal. But another part of me, a deeper part, was convinced that opening my eyes would be a mistake, that whatever was happening was better experienced with eyes closed. Not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because seeing might somehow disrupt the process. Whatever was occurring seemed delicate, tentative, as if it required a specific set of conditions to continue. Movement or sudden awareness might cause it to stop, and for some reason I didn't want it to stop. The warm electrical sensation on my skin was reaching a peak now, not uncomfortable but intense. Every nerve ending felt alive and hypersensitive. I was more aware of my physical body than I'd ever been, as if the boundaries between my skin and the air around me were becoming less distinct. And then, without any transition or warning, the sensations stopped. All of them. The electrical feeling, the metallic smell, the sense of presence, the strange light behind my eyelids. Everything returned to normal so abruptly that the absence felt like a physical shock. I lay there in the sudden ordinariness, listening to my heart rate slowly return to normal. The room felt empty again, truly empty, in a way that made the previous fullness seem even more remarkable by contrast. After a while I opened my eyes. The ceiling looked exactly as it always had. White paint, hairline cracks, nothing unusual. The darkness was normal darkness. The silence was normal silence. Everything was exactly as it should be. I must have fallen asleep shortly after that, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the morning feeling perfectly rested. The whole experience seemed distant and dreamlike, the way unusual dreams do when you recall them in daylight. It was clearly just a hypnagogic hallucination, one of those vivid experiences that can occur in the borderland between waking and sleep. The mind can create remarkably detailed and convincing sensory experiences during these transitional states, nothing more than neurons misfiring in interesting patterns. I went about my normal routine that morning, and everything felt completely ordinary. The strange sensations from the night before seemed like something that had happened to someone else, or something I'd read about rather than experience directly. But I did notice that the ceiling above my bed looked different somehow. Not obviously different, just subtly changed. The paint seemed slightly less yellowed, the cracks slightly less pronounced, as if it had been refreshed overnight, renewed in some imperceptible way. Which was impossible, of course. Ceilings don't repair themselves. It was probably just the morning light hitting it from a different angle, or my eyes adjusting differently after the strange dreams I'd had. Still, I found myself looking up at it frequently throughout the day, not because I expected to see anything unusual, but because it seemed to draw my attention in a way it never had before, as if something about it had become more interesting, more significant. That evening, as I prepared for bed, I felt a familiar anticipation building. Not anxiety, exactly, but a heightened awareness, a sense that the night might bring something worth experiencing. I told myself it was just my mind hoping to repeat an interesting dream. Sometimes, when you have a particularly vivid dream, your subconscious tries to recreate the conditions that produced it. It's a normal psychological phenomenon. But as I turned off the lights and settled into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me. Something patient and attentive, ready to resume whatever had been interrupted the night before. I closed my eyes and listened to the familiar sounds of the house settling into darkness. Everything was normal, everything was as it should be. And yet, as I lay there in the growing quiet, I became aware of a faint metallic scent beginning to gather in the air above me. Equals. Story 10. I assured them I had only walked past, that I'd barely glanced inside the room, not stopping, not looking. Their pens scratched across paper, satisfied by precision. Yet the floor whispered cold under my bare feet, each step tinged with an echo of something forgotten. The air lingered with a metallic chill, catching my breath like a memory unresolved, and those frames, tilted just slightly, seemed to hold their gaze longer than they should. I didn't mention the way the dim light flickered, casting uncertain shapes against the wall, but the shadow had already shifted, hadn't it? To whoever finds this letter, if anyone ever does. I need you to understand something. I've been carrying this weight for months now, maybe longer. Time feels different when you're not sure what's real anymore. The people with the pens and papers, they believed my version of events because it was simple, clean. But lies of omission are still lies, aren't they? And I've been drowning in what I didn't tell them. I'm writing this because I can't sleep anymore. Not really. Even when my eyes close, there's this feeling that something is watching from the corners of rooms I've never been in. My reflection in the bathroom mirror this morning looked tired in a way that went deeper than exhaustion, like something had been borrowed from behind my eyes and never given back. You need to know what really happened in that room. Not the sanitized version I gave them, but the truth that's been eating at me from the inside out. The light wasn't just flickering, it was pulsing. breathing almost. Each time it dimmed, the shadows on the wall would stretch and contract like living things. I stood there longer than I admitted, much longer. My feet had gone numb against the cold floor, but I couldn't move, couldn't look away from those tilted frames. There were 3 of them, old photographs in tarnished silver frames, each one showing the same empty room from slightly different angles. But that's not what held me there. It was the way the images seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Peripheral vision catching movement that shouldn't exist in still photographs. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was just the flickering light playing tricks, but then I saw it again. A shadow moving across the photographed floor. The same floor I was standing on, but in the picture it was different somehow. Older, more worn, and there were footprints in the dust that weren't there in real life. I should have left then. God, I should have just turned around and walked away. But curiosity is a terrible thing when it gets its hooks in you. I stepped closer to the middle frame, the one that seemed to show the exact spot where I was standing. That's when I realized the shadow in the photograph was mine. But I wasn't casting a shadow in the real room. The light was coming from above, harsh and direct. There should have been a clear shadow beneath my feet, but when I looked down, there was nothing. Just the pale, cold floor stretching out like it had swallowed the darkest part of me. I lifted my hand to wave, some childish part of me needing to test what I was seeing. In the photograph, a shadow hand moved. In the real world, nothing. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, steady and indifferent. My breath started coming in short, sharp bursts. The metallic taste in the air grew stronger, coating my tongue like old pennies. I wanted to run, but my legs felt disconnected from my body, heavy and strange, like they belonged to someone else. That's when I heard it, the sound I've been trying to forget ever since. It wasn't quite breathing, more like the whisper of air moving through empty spaces, but it had a rhythm to it, slow and deliberate, in and out, coming from somewhere behind the walls or maybe from the photographs themselves. I pressed my ear to the glass of the middle frame and the sound got clearer. It was breathing, but not human breathing, too measured, too patient, like something that had been waiting for a very long time and could wait much longer still. The photograph under the glass felt warm against my cheek, impossibly warm considering how cold everything else was, and for just a moment I could swear I felt something breathe back against my skin from the other side. I jerked away so fast I nearly fell. The frames rattled against the wall, and suddenly all 3 photographs showed the same thing, an empty room with a single set of footprints leading to the center, where a dark stain spread across the floor like spilled ink. My footprints, my stain. But when I looked down at the real floor, it was clean, unmarked, just cold concrete that seemed to stretch on forever in every direction. I ran then. Finally my legs remembered how to move, and I stumbled out of that room like something was chasing me. Maybe something was. I could feel eyes on my back the entire way down the hallway, watching from impossible angles. The people with the pens and papers asked me routine questions. Had I disturbed anything? Had I seen anyone else? Had I noticed anything unusual? I lied to all of them, told them I'd barely glanced inside, just walked past like any normal person would. They wrote it all down with their careful precision, and I signed my name to a statement that felt like betraying myself. But that was months ago, and things have gotten worse since then. I started noticing the breathing sound in other places, quiet at first, just at the edge of hearing, in elevators between floors, in the space between radio stations, in the pause between my heartbeats when I'm trying to fall asleep. And the shadows, they're all wrong now. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them moving independently, sliding across walls and floors like they're searching for something. Other times I can't find my shadow at all. I'll be standing in bright sunlight and the ground beneath me stays stubbornly light. People have started looking at me strangely, not with recognition exactly, but like they're trying to place where they know me from. Cashiers pause when they hand me change, their fingers lingering just a moment too long. Children stare at me in grocery stores until their parents pull them away with uncomfortable laughs. Last week I ran into someone I went to school with. We'd known each other for years, sat next to each other in 3 different classes. But when I said hello, they looked right through me, not with malice or rudeness, but with genuine confusion, like I was speaking a language they couldn't quite understand. I showed them my driver's license, pointed to my name, tried to jog their memory with shared experiences. Nothing. They were polite but distant, the way you are with strangers who seem to know more about you than they should. That night I stood in front of my bathroom mirror for an hour, studying my reflection. It looked like me, but somehow flattened, like a photograph of a person rather than the person themselves. When I moved my hand, the reflection followed, but just a fraction of a second too late. I've been avoiding mirrors since then, and photographs, and any surface that might show me something I don't want to see. The breathing sound is constant now. It follows me everywhere, a steady rhythm that doesn't match my own breathing or heartbeat. Sometimes I think it's coming from inside my chest, like something has taken up residence behind my ribs. I've started leaving lights on at night because the darkness feels too full of watching eyes. But even with every bulb blazing, I can see shapes moving in my peripheral vision. Patient shadows that freeze when I try to look at them directly. I think I'm disappearing, not all at once, but slowly, like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The edges of me are getting softer, less defined. People look through me more often now. Conversations stop when I approach, not because I'm unwelcome, but because I'm somehow not quite there enough to include. Yesterday I tried to call my family. My own mother answered the phone with the careful politeness she reserves for telemarketers. When I said my name, there was a long pause, and then she asked who was calling. I repeated myself, explained who I was, reminded her of things only her child would know. She listened patiently, then said she was sorry, but she didn't have anyone by that name in her family. Her voice was kind but firm, the way you speak to someone who's confused but harmless. She hung up gently, leaving me holding a phone that felt heavier than it should. I drove by my childhood home that evening. The lights were on, and I could see figures moving behind the curtains. My family living their lives in a space I used to belong to, but when I knocked on the door, they looked at me like a stranger, not with anger or fear, just with the polite confusion reserved for lost tourists asking for directions. I think the room took something from me, something essential that I didn't even know I had until it was gone. Maybe it was my shadow. Maybe it was whatever makes people remember you exist. Maybe it was the part of me that cast a reflection in mirrors and left footprints on dusty floors. Or maybe I'm losing my mind, and all of this is just the elaborate fiction of a brain that can't handle whatever really happened in that room. Maybe the breathing sound is just tinnitus. Maybe the moving shadows are just tired eyes playing tricks. Maybe my family really doesn't remember me because there was never anything worth remembering. But I don't think so. Deep down in the part of me that still feels solid and real, I know something was taken, something important. And whatever took it is still there, in that room with the tilted frames and the breathing walls, waiting for someone else to step inside and linger too long. I can feel myself getting fainter as I write this. My handwriting looks thin on the page, like ink that's been watered down. My fingers feel translucent when I hold them up to the light. Soon I think I'll be gone entirely, not dead exactly, but erased. A person-shaped absence that nobody will notice because there won't be anything left to notice. If you're reading this, it means someone found it. Maybe in the room where all this started, maybe somewhere else entirely. Either way, it means I was real enough, at least for a while, to leave something behind. Don't go looking for that room. Don't try to find those photographs or listen for that breathing sound. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened. But if you do find yourself in a place that feels too cold, where the light flickers with its own rhythm and shadows move independently of their sources, don't linger. Don't let curiosity override caution. Don't press your ear to warm glass or try to test what you're seeing. Just walk away, keep walking, don't look back. Because some things once seen can't be unseen, and some rooms once entered never really let you leave. I can barely see my hand as I write these last words. The pen feels like it's moving through water, and the letters on the page keep fading before I can finish them. If this letter survives when I don't, maybe that's enough. Maybe being remembered by ink and paper is better than not being remembered at all. The breathing sound is very loud now, patient and steady and close. I think it's time to equals.